Tonight's event with Dr. Michael Sharnoff is Nasser's Peace, Egypt's Response to the 1967 War with Israel. Dr. Sharnoff, what inspired you to write this book about this topic?
This book was adapted from my doctoral dissertation. I wanted to write about the 1967 war. And in my preliminary research, I found that there was a lot of secondary literature already available on the events leading up to the war, a lot of military history about the war itself. But aside from a few passages about the Khartoum resolution in September, which issued the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no diplomatic relations, and the passing of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, there wasn't a whole lot of information. What was happening both publicly and privately behind the scenes after the war. And so, with my research, I seek to fill this gap.
Who was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and what ideology defined his foreign policy?
Well, Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in Alexandria, Egypt, in 1918. He was the son of a postal clerk, comes from very modest, humble origins. He was in the armed forces as a lieutenant colonel, and he fought in the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948. And he was part of a clandestine movement known as the Free Officers that in 1952 overthrew the monarchy that was King Farouk. And these officers were young, they were revolutionary, and they sought to bring Egypt into modernity. And initially, what we learn about Nasser is he's primarily focused on consolidating his rule, suppressing the domestic opposition, which at that time was the communists, Egyptian communists, and the Islamists, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. After a few years of sustaining his rule, we see that Nasser is a very, very ambitious individual. In his 1954 memoir, The Philosophy of the Revolution, he talks about Egypt's unique geostrategic location in Africa, in the Arab world, and in the Islamic world. And in these three arenas, he believed that Egypt should play a leading role in the Arab world. And so, how he sought to achieve this goal of being the undisputed spokesperson of the Arab world, he adopted Pan-Arabism. Now, what is Pan-Arabism? Pan-Arabism is basically a secular ideology that emphasizes that the Arabs should be unified based on the language that they speak and a common culture. It de-emphasizes their religion. So in theory, Muslims and Christians that are Arabic-speaking should be united together. So it was secular. But we see that Nasser takes this Pan-Arabism in his quest to be the leader of the Arabs. He seeks to unite his country with Syria in 1958. That was known as the United Arab Republic, where Egypt merged with Syria. However, from the Syrian perspective, this was not a merger of equals, but this was an Egyptian occupation of Syrian territory. And that's why the merger dissolved in 1961. And Nasser's Pan-Arabism also led him to foreign adventures in Yemen, where he supported the radicals in a proxy war against Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis backed the royalists. And it was a very humiliating defeat for the Egyptians. It was sometimes dubbed as Egypt's Vietnam. So that's kind of the ideology that led him. Pan-Arabism. It was a secular ideology that emphasized Arab unity, Arab socialism, which was a statist-based economy where the state should manipulate the economic affairs, an alliance with Moscow, and perhaps Pan-Arabism's most cherished goal, adopting the Arab cause of Palestine, advocating for the liberation of Palestine, which at that time was a euphemism for the creation of a Palestinian state, not alongside Israel, but in place of Israel.
Well, that leads me to my next question. You cite in the book the paradox of Nasser's Pan-Arabism and his treatment of the Palestinians in reality. Can you elaborate on this?
It is traditionally known in the discourse that Nasser is considered to be the champion of the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian people. However, if you really look at how he managed the Palestinian matter, from 1948 to 1967, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. It run the territory very harshly with a string of Egyptian governors. The people in Gaza were denied Egyptian citizenship and autonomy. They were never put on the road towards statehood. They were really used as pawns at Nasser's disposal, so Nasser could manipulate and dominate the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian movement. Nasser was instrumental in creating the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964. It was under Egyptian auspices, the PLO. To King Hussein's credit of Jordan, he was the only Arab leader that offered the Palestinian citizenship. Nasser did not.
Your book focuses on Nasser's attitudes toward peace post-1967, post the end of the war. What were his attitudes toward peace with Israel prior to the war?
Prior to the war, Nasser's views fluctuated. There are instances where he would call for the destruction of Israel by using military force, and then there's other instances that we see where Nasser would say more ambiguous things, saying that the liberation of Palestine cannot be done presently, therefore it should be delegated to future generations of Egyptians and Arabs. What's fascinating is, come May 1967, Nasser engages in a series of provocative actions by blockading the Straits of Tiran, expelling the United Nations peacekeeping forces in Sinai. These were catalysts that provoked Israel to launch a preemptive strike. And in May of '67, we see Nasser and his state-run media making constant daily declarations calling for the annihilation of Israel, in no uncertain terms. What's fascinating is after the war, whereby Israel in just 6 days quadruples its territory by conquering the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, we see Nasser sort of adopt a new strategy that seeks to be both radical and revolutionary and also pragmatic. He's no longer explicitly calling for the destruction of Israel, but rather a slogan that he coins, the elimination of the traces of aggression. But he's not specifically saying what that aggression is. Does that mean the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza? Or does it mean also the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem? Or does it mean that perhaps Israel in its entirety, because we have to remember that prior to 1967, Israel was collectively known in the Arabic press as an illegal, illegitimate entity. It was not recognized. Its very legitimacy was disputed. So that was his sort of clever way to regain the lost Arab territories without dismissing the possibility of having a future war against Israel.
Let's talk about the war itself, or the aftermath. Many readers may be surprised to learn that Nasser severed diplomatic relations with the United States after the conclusion of the war, and he invoked the Big Lie conspiracy. What was this?
So to absolve himself from this humiliating defeat, you have to remember what the climate was like, especially in May of 1967, those few weeks leading up to the war. Nasser and all the Arab capitals were making daily declarations that this will be a wash, the Arab armies will destroy Israel, there's no way tiny Israel can defeat the Arab armies. That didn't happen. So to rationalize this very humiliating defeat, Nasser and Jordanian King Hussein concocted what was known as this myth of Western collusion. They propagated a myth that Israel's victory was attributed to direct British and American military intervention. Now, this clearly was a fabrication. This was not true. This was their way to absolve themselves of responsibility. To King Hussein's credit, he retracted this myth a month after the war. Nasser and his state-run media continued propagating it a year later, up until 1968, even after the evidence surfaced and proved to the contrary, that there was no Western conspiracy. But this conspiracy had severe consequences for the United States and Western interests. During and after the war, there were riots in some of the Arab capitals targeting British and American officials. Egypt expelled American officials working in Cairo. And Egypt also took revenge against its small but significant Egyptian Jewish population. In the 20th century, there was approximately 75,000 Egyptian Jews, but as a result of the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948, and then the Suez Campaign in 1956, by the time 1967 comes around, there's only about 7,000 Jews left, and after the war, that number trickled down to about 500. Most either fled out of fear, they were perceived as fifth columns, as traitors. In other words, you cannot be a proud Egyptian and loyal citizen because of Israel. Your loyalties are to somewhere else. And in other cases, they had their property and citizenship revoked and confiscated.
I believe actually at one point in the 50s, they brought in former Nazi officials to assist with the confiscation.
That's right, not just in Cairo, but in Damascus as well.
Damascus as well.
Yes. And I should say really quickly
Yes.
that the United States State Department contemplated on how to respond to this provocation should the United States expel Egyptians living in the United States. And ultimately it was decided that that would be immoral and counterproductive, so there were no decisions to expel in retaliation to Nasser's provocation, shameful provocation, to expel Egyptian nationals living in the United States.
Examining recently declassified Soviet and American intelligence documents, what surprised you the most about Nasser's back-channel communications? Maybe you want to mention his four-tiered approach. We're talking now post the war has ended, and
Sure. One of the most surprising things to me was, again, going back to the sort of historiography and the common discourse that Nasser was the champion of the Palestinian people. During some of these private diplomatic consultations with his Soviet, British, or American interlocutors, there are instances where Nasser was totally willing to abandon the Palestinian cause for an Egypt-first policy. In other words, Nasser entertained the possibility in these private consultations that it could have some type of non-belligerency pact with Israel if Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And whenever the Palestine question resurfaced, he would say, I'm not talking about Palestine, this is about Egyptian territory. We can remove the Palestinian leadership, they're not a threat, pay no attention to that. So that was very revealing to me, and it sort of challenges his narrative of a hero of the Arab nation and of the Palestinian cause. But in addition to that, what I thought was really incredible was just how skillful Nasser and clever Nasser really was in these private diplomatic consultations with the Soviets, with the British, with the Americans. He would not only say different things to different countries, but he would say different things to different people from those countries, depending on the mood, depending on how he felt, which, as I argue in the book, really calls into the question the sincerity of these private communications. Was Nasser truly interested in terminating the conflict with Israel and restoring the lost territories? Or was Nasser really interested in sustaining his unique leadership role in the Arab world and biding his time, relying on the Soviets for military equipment to prepare for another round of war with Israel? Based on the evidence, I argue that Nasser wanted to hold on. He was not prepared to make a lasting, comprehensive peace with Israel. He was more interested in sustaining his role, and to achieve that, he adopted a four-tiered strategic communication strategy that included his public declarations, his public speeches, which would vow never to recognize Israel, and to resort to both the military option as well as entertaining diplomacy at the United Nations to regain the lost territories, but without violating those three no's that were issued at the Arab League Summit in Khartoum in September 1967. no peace with Israel, no negotiations, and no recognition. He wanted to use a third-party conduit like the Soviets, like the United Nations, that would allow him to regain territory without explicitly recognizing Israel and signing a comprehensive peace treaty with the Jewish state.
And he did not want to negotiate directly with them.
He refused to negotiate directly. His thinking was it's better to have the Americans, the Soviets, or the UN to be the middle person, so that way, if negotiations failed, he wasn't directly responsible, and he could shift the blame to a third party, which of course he did. There was an instance that I document in the book that during the summer of 1967, after the war, you have all these hearings in the United Nations. The United States diplomatic proposals, the Soviets, you have a Latin American proposal, you have an Afro-Asian proposal. All these different countries were trying to formulate strategies to resolve the conflict diplomatically and peacefully. There was a proposal proffered by the Latin American bloc that called on Israel to relinquish every inch of territory occupied during the war, not just the Sinai, but all the territories from Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And in exchange, all Egypt had to do was to issue a declaration of non-belligerency. It did not require explicit recognition or comprehensive peace treaties, and the Egyptians refused. And what's fascinating is just a few months ago, Mohammed al-Baradei, Egyptian diplomat, he was the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. He, in a speech, said, and he was there at the time at the United Nations. He was a young man. He said, "We had an opportunity to regain the territory without requiring us to sacrifice our basic principles, and we said no. We were not serious about ending the state of war and having peace with Israel. And this could be a missed opportunity."
So what were Nasser's real attitudes then? I mean, it's convoluted. There are many things said by different people, including Nasser, his media, his surrogates, but did he actually want peace, or was it?
It's difficult to know what precisely, in his heart of hearts, Nasser really thought about this notion of peace. The challenge is that his public and private declarations would undermine when, if he in fact would say, "I really do want an end of the conflict," sometimes to his Western hosts, whether he was speaking to the British or the Americans, he would say, "We want peace, we're not interested in resuming another war, we want to resolve the conflict diplomatically." But at the same breath, while he's speaking to his Soviet friends, he would say the opposite. "Give us arms, we're not going to recognize Israel, and we want the ability to force Israel off the land using military force." And again, it just really made it so convoluted, these conflicting narratives, and really calls into question the sincerity of his peace efforts. Did he really want to end the state of war? Which is ironic, because at the time, Nasser was the most popular, by far, Arab leader in the Middle East. So if anyone were to conclude a unilateral settlement, he had the most legitimacy, but he didn't want to.
What are some lessons learned for today?
There's many lessons. One lesson that comes to mind is that this should be a case study of how a small, developing country with a declining economy, remember Egypt was losing millions of dollars after the war in canal revenues and in tourism. Egypt had to import wheat to provide for its people. It needed plenty of wheat shipments from the Soviets. Egypt lost significant territory, and yet it still managed to skillfully play off the superpowers of the day, the Soviet Union and the United States, to maximize concessions and offering very little in return. And if we just look at what's going on today in the world, one country that comes to mind, if you look at how Syria, many people within the first year probably thought that Assad cannot survive this. Sooner or later, he'll be ousted, something will happen, the status quo can't persist. He has proved everyone wrong in that sense of being a real survivor. We should understand the way Nasser viewed things, how he wanted to hold on to power, his legitimacy, how he viewed the world, and we should understand that when we look at someone like Assad, who's speaking to the Russians, he's speaking to the Americans, and I don't see him going anywhere or ceding any sort of power in some kind of power-sharing government in the foreseeable future. And we should be very alive and open to the possibility of the limitations of US influence in some of these developing countries and not have a condescending attitude toward them.
Well, I think that it's time to open the floor to questions. Dr. Sharnoff, would you like to call on people? Or you can So please, if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand. Yes, in the front here.
Hey, do we see you talk about the Islamist, do you see the seeds of kind of like the modern Middle East?
I think I'll bring the microphone around, so.
Cameron County, do you see this, you were referring to the Islamists, do you see the seeds of kind of the groups that we see now taking control of parts of the Middle East? Do you see like little tremors of that in the studies that you did?
Thank you for your question. Another outcome that we are still grappling with today is that we're still living with the consequences of this war. To this day, a comprehensive Arab-Israeli settlement remains elusive. What's especially revealing is that with this humiliating Arab defeat, as they saw it, what it really revealed was the hollowness, the bankruptcy of this pan-Arab ideology. You have to remember that at that point in 1967, the Arabs could no longer blame it on foreign occupation, the British, the West, the Ottomans, because all those leaders were no longer there. This was, Nasser was the first native Arabic-speaking Egyptian to rule his country, speaking the Arabic language in a long time, because under the Ottomans, they came from a Turco-Circassian class. They did not speak Arabic. They ruled very distant from the population. So that meant something. But with the defeat in 1967 and the decline of Pan-Arabism and Nasser's untimely death in 1967, he was only in his early 50s, 52 I think, we see the rise, gradually, of non-state Islamist actors, the Muslim Brotherhood, who were long suppressed under some of these more secular regimes, like under Nasser, like under Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Nasser suppressed the Islamists. He viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat. And so we're seeing this resurgence in the 1970s and 1980s of these Islamist movements who are, in addition to providing social services, gaining momentum and popularity at the grassroots level, they're articulating a narrative that the reason why we are not masters of our own destiny is because we were led by apostate Arab regimes that were not implementing Islamic law. They were subservient to either the Soviets or the Americans, both considered apostate, infidel, and Islam is the solution. Islam huwa al-hal. That's the campaign slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood. The notion is that for Muslims to achieve their full potential, there should be an Islamic state ruled by Islamic law. And we see in more recent times some Islamist movements using the ballot box, participating in the political process with Hamas in Gaza and Nahda in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, seeking to achieve their goals. But we also see more violent manifestations in groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State that do not recognize this Westphalian international system where you have nation-state boundaries and sovereignty. They don't recognize that. They're seeking to erase the borders. And I think the West is struggling with crafting not only a strategy, a comprehensive strategy to defeat these Islamist movements, but also on the ground, but also the ideology that inspires them.
We have a question back here.
Dr. Sharnoff, could you speak a little bit about what surprised you as you researched the book, and what an unexpected challenge was?
Thank you for your question. It was interesting to see, looking at some of these declassified Western intelligence cables, even Soviet cables, that thought at the time that after sustaining this humiliating loss, losing territory, this declining economy, that there would be a coup in Egypt. That something would happen where Nasser would no longer remain in power. But again, I think he surprised many. His charisma, even after the war, he still remained the undisputed leader in the Arab world. I think Nasser should be studied like a case study of a real survivalist, someone who was brilliant, someone who truly did play off the world powers at the time, and despite all the setbacks that he faced, he really was a survivor. And at the end of the day, he did not compromise on what he saw as his core principles of Arab solidarity and Arab unity. He refused to recognize Israel, to sign a peace treaty. It took another decade under Anwar Sadat, his successor, to make this kind of courageous and bold gambit toward peace. And he paid for it dearly. We've also seen on the Israeli side with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he also paid for it. That was the price for his life with the signing of the Oslo Accords. He was assassinated by an Israeli extremist who thought that peace with the Palestinians was not the right thing to do. But I think Nasser was a real survivalist. He was a real survivor, and should not be underestimated.
Hey, Michael. Gamal Abdel Nasser had a tremendous amount of charisma. Talk about that a little bit, because
Sure.
where Anwar Sadat did not, but Anwar Sadat had more results, I guess, for Egypt than. But Nasser had tremendous charisma. Can you talk about how he?
Sure, he absolutely did. Nasser was kind of collectively known in Egypt as one among the people. He did not speak in the formal Arabic. It's called Fusha. It's the modern standard Arabic. When he would give speeches, he spoke in the Egyptian dialect so that everyone on the street could understand him. He was charming. He had a sense of humor. He lived a very humble and modest lifestyle, so people could not ostensibly accuse him of being out of touch or corrupt. He didn't live in a lavish palace far away like the Shah of Iran did, for instance, or Mubarak. And he had a sense of humor. Just as an anecdote, there was a speech that he gave in which there was someone in the audience, I think he was a Muslim Brotherhood activist, that said, "I implore you, Nasser, to institute the veil for all the women in Egypt. We must have the veil for all the females in Egypt." And his response to that was, "You, sir, can't even make your own daughter wear the veil. How do you expect me to make 40 million wear the veil?" So, and everyone busted in laughter and applause. He did have a sense of humor. He had style, charisma. And we should not forget, he was, part of the non-aligned movement, a hero in these developing countries. He rubbed shoulders with the likes of Tito of Yugoslavia, Nehru of India, and Sukarno of Indonesia. He was a massive anti-imperialist leader, and we haven't seen a leader quite like him since.
Yeah, I have a question. You alluded to Arab nationalism and Pan-Arabism, and that he played the superpowers against each other. I'd like to know if you saw any lessons learned for today as to, since that seems like almost Arab nationalism is on the run, and that Islamists are more prevalent, what's the lesson learned for particularly the United States as to their involvement in all of this today?
Thank you for that question. It is true that Arab nationalism is in retreat. Secularism, secular politics in the Arab world have been in retreat for decades now. We are seeing that resurgence of Islamist movements. Again, a lesson learned, I would say, is understanding, the limitations of U.S. influence in some of these countries that we're dealing with, and not having a condescending attitude when leaders, just as an example, when we see repeatedly leaders in the Muslim Brotherhood talking about, who by the way are educated, and some of them are physicians, doctors. These are not illiterates or destitutes by any means, but when they say repeatedly, this is what we seek to achieve, we want an Islamic State, we understand a special role for minorities, we understand that they should occupy an inferior role, and we want to rebuild the caliphate. If we have this kind of condescension where, well, they don't really mean what they say, they're just saying that, that's just domestic, for domestic consumption, and they don't really mean that. I think we should be a little bit more humble and not hysterical, but humble, in that if you have people repeatedly telling us in Arabic every day what their goals are and what their philosophy is, we should not be surprised when, for example, when the Muslim Brotherhood did win, Mohammed Morsi, when he did win elections in Egypt, and then all of a sudden he sought to gradually transform the Egyptian society, people were shocked. There was this refrain, especially here in the Beltway, that once the Islamists gain power, they'll moderate. They'll be forced to moderate once they gain power. That's a complete misrepresentation of everything they've been telling us for the past 40 years. So that's all I'm saying.
I had a question about his early childhood and the influences that helped him to become the leader that he became. You mentioned his ambition, and was that?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about
thank you. He was an avid reader. He admired nationalist figures like Kemal Mustafa Ataturk, the founder of the modern Republic of Turkey, Chamberlain, Gandhi. He was well read. He had a very good understanding of how things, of how policy was in other parts of the world, and he was in constant contact with his close advisor, Mohammed Heikel, who was the editor of Egypt's flagship publication, Al-Aram. Heikel used to joke that Al-Aram is a free publication, it's independent. No one else reads my publication, my articles, except for Nasser on Thursday when they're released on Friday. So he helped shape Nasser's opinions and was very influential. I cite him heavily throughout the book because we do have to remember that although Nasser was popular, Egypt was still a dictatorship. And in the Egyptian media, the press, you can't deviate far from the official party line. And of course that's true not just in Egypt or the Arab countries, but at the time China, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, that's just how it was. So examining the Arab media, the Egyptian media, was very useful in the book because that reveals popular sentiment that the government wishes to convey.
Do you have any brothers and sisters? No. Do you have any surviving family?
His daughter, I know, Hoda Abdel Nasser, has a website, which I also happen to use for sources in the book, where they have his speeches. And you can find some Arabic, English, and French. It's all translated in different languages online of some of Nasser's public statements, diaries, pictures, and that's all searchable online to kind of preserve his legacy and memory.
I think we have a question over here from.
Yeah, congratulations, Dr. Sharnoff, for a great book. Earlier tonight, you mentioned the big lie about using official media to propagate a narrative of Western conspiracy or collusion. Do you think this occurred because of the 1956 crisis?
There certainly was no love lost between Nasser, between Egypt, and the British. We have to remember that it was the British and the French in collusion with Israel that launched the war against Egypt in 1956. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the British and the French interpreted that as an economic assault. Why? They had been majority stakeholders in the Suez Canal Company. So they wanted to punish Nasser, and it didn't take much coaxing to the Israelis, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that sort of wisdom, to do that. So yes, Nasser was already a little suspicious, to say the least. But I want to stress that this was a fabrication. There was no direct Western military intervention. He tried to say that he could see evidence of planes with U.S. insignia on the fighter jets. That was just a fabrication.
There's another question.
I think this is probably related to the question about for today. I'm intrigued by your remarks about the parallels between Assad and Nasser and the staying power. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Excellent question. Assad's worldview is a zero-sum game. From his perspective, he cannot relinquish power, territory, without the possibility of not only himself, his Alawite family, from being slaughtered. He sees his war in Syria against the opposition as a zero-sum game. If he does not destroy the opposition, which, by the way, he paints the opposition, including the more moderate opposition, that does not include radical elements like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, he views all of them as terrorists. He is continuing the legacy from his father, Hafez al-Assad, of having close, intimate relations with Moscow, and really championing the notion that Syria should occupy a primary role in Arab affairs. He's not going to surrender. He's made statements repeatedly that I am a Syrian national, I'll live here, I'll die here, I'm never going to go, like we saw in Tunisia with Ben Ali, who fled shortly after the uprisings in 2010. But he's very clever and smart. Again, many people thought that it was just a matter of time before he would be deposed. But he's proved time and time again that he knows what he's doing. He's using the Russians and the Chinese and the UN for veto cover to block any type of humanitarian relief for a security corridor against civilians in Syria, and against condemnations against the Syrian regime in general. And what he's articulating to the West is, see, look at the Russians. They're standing by us. And you Americans, you don't stand by your friends. So pay notice, other Arab countries, other developing countries. You should not be trusting of the United States or of the West. We're looking toward the Soviets, we're looking toward the Russians, toward the East. And we are going to maximize our political concessions, but don't expect the Syrian regime to offer any grand overtures. His primary goal is staying in power, and the Russian primary objective, it's not human rights, it's not about creating a democracy in Syria, it's a one-liner, the preservation of the Assad regime. And to their credit, they are prepared to send military force to achieve their goals.
Dr. Sharnoff, thanks for a great presentation. 40 years ago, the Soviet Union was removed as a player of any serious sort in the Middle East. And under this immediate past administration, they returned in full flourish. Wondering what you think our strategic options are now in the region with a revitalized Russian presence.
That's a very difficult question to answer. There are areas in which U.S. and Russian interests converge in Syria, but there's also areas in which they diverge. And Syria is incredibly complicated because you have so many local and foreign actors intertwined, involved, proxy war. I think, to be totally candid, I think our options in Syria are very limited. If we're thinking of regime change, I don't think that's an option, a viable option. Arming the Syrian opposition is also proving problematic. You also have the Kurds, a non-state actor, that are part of the dynamic, that have been very effective on the ground in fighting Islamic State. So I would say humility and no easy solutions, but it is worth examining the areas in which our interests with Russia align, but we also need to be very clear about just what those Russian interests are and have very realistic expectations.
Another question back here.
Do you see Nasser, like publicly or privately, having any trouble sort of reconciling his authoritarian rule at home with his anti-imperialist beliefs internationally?
In truth, there really wasn't a whole lot of domestic opposition to Nasser during his rule. That actually really doesn't surface until about 1968, and it's really over bread, the price of bread riots. Although Nasser was, by definition, a dictator, I mean, he was unelected, and Egypt was not a democracy, he had that popular mandate because, the Arab world viewed him, not the Saudis, not the Jordanians, not the Moroccans or the Tunisians, all of whom he vied for influence. They viewed him as, out of all the Arab leaders, he would be best served to satisfy their aspirations. So, in short, he received somewhat of a pass, suspending certain civil liberties. If the euphoria was he was going to deliver the goods.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Could you explain a little more clearly in which areas U.S. and Russian influences do not converge in areas that are vital to the U.S. National security?
Thank you for that question.
Syria.
Just a quick example, because it is quite complicated. If you recall, back in 2013, the United States government issued a declaration saying that if Assad deploys chemical weapons, that would be a red line. But the Russians had no problem, or at least on the surface, still supporting their client, knowing what the Assad government was doing and still is doing. So that was clearly a difference of opinion, where at the time we thought Assad was part of the problem, not the solution, and therefore he should step down, that there should be some type of coalition government or power-sharing government or a new government, but that Assad really should not play a primary role. The Russians don't see it that way.
What else?
Well, one could look to, in terms of interests, is it a U.S. interest currently to have American boots on the ground in Syria? The Russians clearly think it's a Russian imperative. Do we think that? We're now, 6 years, 7 years into the Syrian civil war, and 500,000 dead. So that's another interest of where you have competing priorities. I'm not entirely sure what the United States' precise strategy is in Syria, because it changes. But again, to Russia's credit, they have been consistent about what their goal is in Syria. And I think that we will see some short-term dividends on behalf of the Russians, but I would also caution that the Islamists in Syria will not forget who abandoned them in their time of need. And if they're looking at the Russians as aggressors and bombing them, make no mistake that it is highly possible that as the Russians retreat, and they will ultimately, that we can expect violence and terrorism to follow the Russians back home in Moscow as revenge for not supporting them and for bombing them.
Is there no major ideological differences?
Well, the Russian objective in Syria has never purported to pretend to care about civilians, human rights, democracy, and those are principles that the United States and other Western countries do talk about the need to have safe zones to protect the civilian population. The same cannot be said unequivocally and unambiguously about the Russian or the Chinese position. And they routinely try to block these efforts in the United Nations Security Council with their veto power to prevent that type of humanitarian relief.
Another question?
It's my understanding that in the Arab countries, it's more tribalism than nationalism. For example, in Syria, it's the Alawites who want to maintain control. In Jordan, it's the Hashemites. When Nasser was ruling Egypt, was it more nationalistic than tribal? And if it was tribal, what was the tribe?
Well, thank you for that question. With Egypt's particular case, Egypt is basically a homogenous society. Yes, there's about a 10% Coptic Christian minority, but the majority of Egyptians are Egyptian, Sunni Muslim, Arabic speakers. Unlike if we look at these very heterodox societies like in Iraq and Syria, you have Sunni, Shia, Alawite, Druze, Kurds, Armenians, Greek Orthodox Christian, Greek Catholics, Assyrians, Yazidi, I mean the list goes on and on. So that homogenous society in Egypt worked to Nasser's favor with that respect. I also want to emphasize that this pan-Arabist secular ideology was always a top-down phenomenon. It was never really a grassroots bottom-up ideology like the way the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist movements are. And that's why, with the defeat in 1967 and Nasser's death in 1970, Pan-Arabism, we saw attempts to revive it through Gaddafi's Libya, through Saddam's Iraq, even through Hafez al-Assad, but they never had the popular legitimacy, not the legal legitimacy, because they're all unelected, but they never had that sort of mandate that Nasser had. Nasser was the undisputed leader of the Arab world. He was the one that if there were to be an agreement, he was going to mold it and ratify it. And just on that note, as we near the 50th anniversary next month of the 1967 war, Egyptians of that generation and those actors that may have been involved intimately in the conflict perhaps will reflect with a degree of nostalgia of a bygone era where Cairo dominated the Middle East. Cairo was the capital. What Nasser said and did was closely monitored by Israel, the neighboring Arab states, the United States, the Soviet Union. And if you look at Egypt today, not only does Egypt not project influence beyond its borders, it's struggling to contain an insurgency in Sinai, to provide security for its Christian minority, and to provide meaningful 21st century skills and jobs to sustain its population. I mean, it is a shadow of its former self, and that's not just true about Egypt. This is a broader phenomenon in the Arab world. With the partial exception of Saudi Arabia, if we look at the map today, the Arab countries do not dictate policy and do not project influence beyond their borders. There are multiple governments in Libya, and Libya is plagued with civil war in Yemen. Lebanon, until recently, had been without a president for over 2 years. And of course, in Syria and Iraq, we don't even know if those countries, frankly speaking, will be there next week. The borders are being erased before our eyes. One of the ironies is that if you look at the map today, the three primary actors in the greater Middle East are non-Arab countries: Iran, Turkey, and Israel, none of whom are Arab states. So those three countries, coupled with the rise of the non-state actors, the Islamist movements with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, they are creating a whole new map that we have to contend with. It's a whole new reality. And just to go back to Iran for a moment, Iran and its influence in Iraq with the Shia militia, the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen, they are now influencing directly and indirectly a fifth of the Arab world. Think about that. That's something that Nasser, in his wildest imagination, could never have fathomed. And it's a non-Arab player that can achieve that type of influence. That speaks volumes. It's a whole new geopolitical landscape that we have to deal with.
Where does Dubai come in on that?
Dubai? The United Arab Emirates is a Sunni Arab country,
Is it right?
but Bahrain is ruled by a Sunni minority over a majority Shia population. And Iran seeks influence in a proxy war against Saudi Arabia in some of those Gulf states.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Do you see a modern Nasser on the horizon? Someone with his charisma and popularity, someone who might have the influence like that?
No,
That's an easy question, everyone.
but it's a good question.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone. Please join me in thanking Dr. Sharnoff.